jazz improvisation. You've got questions about chord scales and getting lost in the changes. Let's talk about it. Hi, and welcome to the Saxophone Academy. I'm Dr. Wally Wallace, and if you're interested in saxophone masterclasses, please do subscribe and be sure to hit the like button to unlock the mysteries of the tritone substitution. Now today we're talking about jazz improvisation, and this will be the first in a 5-video series on jazz improv. Now in this first lesson, we're going to be talking a little bit and answering some of your most commonly asked questions. You guys had a few. Earlier this week, I reached out to the Coffee House forum and also through my email list asking, what questions do you guys have about jazz improv but have been too afraid to ask? The response was overwhelming, and I mean literally. I got dozens and dozens and dozens of posts on the Coffee House and literally hundreds of emails and private messages asking me questions about jazz improvisation that a lot of you were just kind of too afraid to ask. So before we get into the playing workshops in the next several weeks, I want to lay some groundwork and answer some of these questions and kind of reduce your mental clutter and about how you think about jazz improvisation. But we have to start with a disclaimer. What I'm saying works for me, works for my brain, works for my students. But no one can tell you this is the right or wrong way to approach improvisation, or specifically jazz improvisation. I do not tolerate gatekeepers or anyone that will say, you have to do it this way because the cats did it that way back in the day, or my teacher taught me this. There's a lot of different ways to approach improvisation in jazz. No way is necessarily right or wrong, including my own way. This works for me, it works for my students, and if you're following my channel, probably will connect with a lot of you as well. But again, there are other people who will disagree. They're not wrong. We're just taking different roads to the top of the mountain. So let's start with the most commonly asked question I got this week. When we're improvising, do we play scales or chords or chord tones or both? What do we do? Now for me, the bottom line is how we view our job as saxophonists when we're improvising. I don't view our job as outlining chords. There's some guys already doing that, and they're doing a really good job. They're called the rhythm section. The saxophone is a melodic instrument, so I view our job as building melodic content in key areas. You're going to hear me say this again and again, but when it comes to improvising on the saxophone, melody is king. If we think about the early roots of jazz, of music and culture coming over from West Africa, meeting in New Orleans with different ideas and cultures and musics into that great melting pot, it still started, not to boil it down too simplistically, but with melody, melodic riffs and ideas treated in not only call and response, but also heterophony, where you have a melody played and then an altered, improvised melody over the top of it. That's kind of the roots of what we became known as jazz today. It's a very good starting place when we're thinking about how we improvise on the saxophone. So I'll say it again, melody is king. Now, does that mean we have to know scales and chords? Yes, absolutely. How many? We'll talk about that in a second. But at the end of the day, melodies are of course built off scales and chord tones, and the chord sequence and structure give the melody a context. But at the end of the day, we're building melodies. We're going to use the building blocks, but don't think about chords and scales, think about melodic content. It works really well for my brain, and once you start thinking in those terms, I think you're going to be building more exciting improvised solos. The next question I'm asked many times, how many scales, modes, and chords do we need to know? Well, not to be snide or cute, but it depends on your goals. What are you trying to build? Imagine you're going to the hardware store and you decided, I want to get into woodworking. You go to the aisle where they have all the different power tools and such. You could spend millions of dollars on tools and not be able to build the birdhouse or whatever else you want to build. There's endless tool options, but you have to pick the tools that are going to help you build what you want to build. It may just be a hammer and a saw if you're building a birdhouse. I don't know, I don't really build things, but you don't want to go overboard. But viewing the entire section of Home Depot of power tools as necessary is going to make you overwhelmed. We don't need everything. You could play an hour-long, fantastic gig at the local coffee house playing jazz standards with a handful of tools, meaning only a certain few types of chords and scales in different key areas, of course. You can get a lot of mileage out of a few tools if we learn to master those tools. So to boil it down even more simply, I really focus on major and minor scales. because the bulk of Western music and jazz standards, with some exceptions of course, I love modal music, I love Wayne Shorter. Some of that music isn't necessarily exactly major or minor, it's modal, but the bulk, the vast bulk of Western music and jazz standards are in major or minor keys. So if we learn the major and minor scales and learn to alter them, creating melodic content, that's going to get you a lot of mileage. And I find that a very nice way to start to think about it in a more refined way in our brains, to not get overwhelmed and cluttered with a million different scales and modes. Now you may be thinking, but Dr. Wally, we got to know our modes. Think about the blues. That first chord, G7, that's a dominant chord. We have to play Mixolydian, right? Well, I don't know about you, but if you've ever tried playing just a solo on the blues using the Mixolydian mode, it doesn't sound great, because here's a secret. The G, or concert B-flat blues, is not in the key of G dominant. It's in the key of G major. The dominant chords color the sound and make it sound bluesy, but it's G major is actually the key. Minor blues are in a minor key. We're building melodic content within key areas. So now riddle me this. Here's a little bit of phrasing I stole from Bud Shank. Tell me, what scale is this? So if we add up all the notes within that little phrase right there, it's all 12. It's actually technically a chromatic scale. So am I saying use the chromatic scale over a G7 chord? Absolutely not. I'm not saying think of any single scale. I'm saying build melodic content within a key area. So the G major scale is kind of the root, the base of the soup, and we're going to add chromatic passing tones, surround tones as you may know them, appoggiaturas, escape tones, lots of other little colorations along the way. We don't need to break it up into 13 different types of scale fragments. It's simply playing melodic content in the key area of G major. We're going to talk about this a lot over the next couple weeks, but start thinking of key areas, not mixing and matching scales, going by a million miles per hour and trying to match little scale fragments with different chords. For most of us, that's going to make our brains overheat and not be terribly a good idea when we're improvising over chords. Next big common question, how do I start improvising? Where do I get started? Do I just start playing random notes in the key areas? No, think about learning a language, which is a very good analogy. When you learn a language, you start by memorizing a couple of phrases. So if you never spoke English and you were going to come live with me in America, I would teach you two things right off the bat. Number one, where's the bathroom? Number two, I want to buy a hot dog. In America, you can get by with those two phrases alone and live out a perfectly happy life. Next up, how do we keep up with the chord changes and not get lost? This was a very common question, and I got a lot of emails about this. And I have to be honest, you're going to get lost. So how do we get lost less often? This I can help with. Instead of thinking about a million different chords, the chord changes as they're going by, most of our brains can't really keep up, that haven't been playing jazz for decades and decades and decades. Reducing those chord changes to key areas will help a lot. We're going to talk about that in the coming weeks. But beyond that, there's a very simple thing you can do to help stay within the form. It's called, again, the melody. And beyond the melody, we can learn the lyrics. Now, I don't cuss on this channel, but cheese and crackers, guys, you gotta learn the lyrics to the tunes. So instead of thinking of 13 million different chords while you're trying to improvise, what I'm thinking of is, somewhere there's music, how faint the tune. Somewhere there's heaven, how high the moon. I promise I won't sing anymore. Knowing the lyrics to a song helps you remember the melody, which then helps you keep your place in the form. So I'm not thinking of a million different chords when I'm improvising. That melody and those lyrics are kind of running like in the background RAM of my mental computer. They really help you not only understand the song better, but keep your place. So when you learn a tune, don't just start with the horn players. Listen to vocalists sing it and actually learn the lyrics. It's going to help you keep your place a lot better. And it's fun.